Today, we're diving into a case that really shook the nation, the killing of Breonna Taylor.
Yeah.
It's a story that, demands a careful look, an empathetic look, given how complex it is and the questions that it raises about justice and accountability. And as always, all of our sources are available either in the show notes or you can just reach out to us.
Yeah, it's a case that brought so much to the surface, police brutality,
Yeah.
racial injustice, and then the use of no-knock warrants. So given the sensitive nature of all of this, we want to be sure to approach this with respect for the families and everyone involved.
Absolutely. So to start, just to paint a picture of who Breonna Taylor was, can you tell us about her life, a life that was cut tragically short?
Yeah, Breonna was a 26-year-old African-American woman. She was working as an EMT in Louisville, Kentucky. Those who knew her described her as a vibrant, caring person, dedicated to her work in healthcare. She had her whole life ahead of her.
It's hard to even grasp that a life so promising was taken so abruptly. What led to that night, to the police presence at her apartment?
Yeah. Well, this all stems from a police investigation into alleged drug dealing operations. And unfortunately, Breonna's ex-boyfriend, Jamarcus Glover, was a suspect.
Okay, so how does Breonna become part of this investigation?
So the police obtained a no-knock search warrant for her apartment.
Okay.
They alleged that Glover may have been receiving packages containing drugs at her address. They also alleged that Glover may have kept narcotics or drug money at her apartment. And they also cited a car registered to Breonna being seen at a suspected drug house.
So that connection seems, well, tenuous at best.
Yeah, it raises eyebrows, and that's one of the biggest points of contention with this whole case.
Yeah.
The link between Breonna and this alleged drug activity is something that's been heavily scrutinized.
And just to clarify for listeners, what is a no-knock warrant?
So a no-knock warrant basically means that police can enter a property without announcing themselves.
Oh, wow.
Which is a very controversial thing, as you can imagine. They claim the no-knock was necessary because announcing themselves could lead to evidence being destroyed. But the justification for the warrant was, well, it became a central issue in this case.
Yeah, it's unsettling even imagining that scenario, officers bursting in unannounced. It must have been terrifying for her and her boyfriend. So walk us through what we know about that night.
So in the early hours of March 13, 2020, just after midnight, plainclothes police officers went to Breonna's apartment to execute this warrant.
Plainclothes, meaning they weren't even in uniform.
Right.
Wow. That just adds another layer of confusion to an already tense situation.
Exactly.
Wow.
Breonna's boyfriend, Kenneth Walker, was with her at the time. And there's conflicting information about whether the police announced themselves before entering. They claim they did, but Walker says that neither he nor Breonna heard anything. They thought that someone was breaking in.
So in the darkness, with these unidentified people forcing entry, he reacted instinctively.
He did. He fired a warning shot from his legally owned firearm. And that shot hit one of the officers, Jonathan Mattingly, in the leg.
Oh my God. So what happened next?
The police responded immediately. They fired 32 rounds into the apartment.
Oh my God.
Breonna, who was behind Walker, was struck by 6 bullets.
Wow.
And she died at the scene.
She was in her own home.
Right.
It's just unimaginable.
Yeah.
Did the police find any drugs or anything to support their suspicions once they entered her apartment?
This is where it gets kind of disturbing. According to a grand jury testimony from the police, they said that the warrant was never fully executed.
What?
Yeah. Breonna's apartment was never searched after the shooting.
Oh my God.
Yeah. So this added, fuel to the fire of the public outrage and demands for answers in this case.
Yeah, it's just deeply troubling. And even the initial police report, it seemed to raise red flags from the start.
Yeah.
Can you tell us a little more about that?
The initial report claimed that Breonna had no injuries.
No injuries.
And that there was no forced entry. These were contradictions to the facts that led to immediate questions about a possible cover-up.
Yeah, and was there body cam footage to clarify any of this?
No. So these were plainclothes narcotics officers that weren't wearing body cameras. So that missing visual record further hampered efforts to understand what really happened.
And this lack of transparency just feeds into the distrust and suspicion. So tell us about the investigations that were launched.
Right. So multiple investigations were launched. We have the Louisville Metro Police Department's Internal Professional Integrity Unit. We had the FBI, and the Kentucky Attorney General, Daniel Cameron, led a state investigation.
That seems like a lot of eyes on this case. So what were the outcomes, especially regarding potential charges against the officers?
Yeah. So the legal proceedings, they were complicated and to many deeply unsatisfying.
Yeah.
Kenneth Walker, Breonna's boyfriend, was initially charged with assault and attempted murder of a police officer.
Wow.
But those charges were later dismissed with prejudice.
Meaning he couldn't be charged again for the same offense.
Exactly.
Okay, so what about the officers who actually fired into Breonna's apartment? What accountability did they face?
Officer Brett Hankison, who fired 10 rounds blindly through a covered patio door and window, was fired in June 2020.
That sounds incredibly reckless.
Absolutely it was. In September 2020, a state grand jury indicted him on 3 counts of felony first-degree wanton endangerment.
And for those who are familiar, can you just explain what wanton endangerment means legally?
So, essentially, it means that he created a substantial risk of death or serious physical injury to others through his actions. But here's a crucial point. Those charges were related to endangering Breonna's neighbors, not Breonna herself.
Wait, so he wasn't charged for her death?
No. Adding to the outrage, he was acquitted of the wanton endangerment charges in March 2022.
Wow.
Yeah, that decision triggered, widespread protests,
Yeah.
amplified the calls for justice for Breonna.
It's hard to even fathom that. So what about the other officers involved? Mattingly and Cosgrove?
So, Cosgrove, who fired the fatal shot that killed Breonna, was fired in 2021.
So at least he was removed from the force.
Yes, but initially none of the officers faced any indictment for Breonna's death.
That feels like a profound miscarriage of justice.
Yeah, and that sentiment was shared by many. But there's more to this story. We haven't even touched on the federal investigation and multiple lawsuits that stemmed from this case.
Right.
This is where things get even more intricate legally.
So let's unpack that. In August 2022, the Department of Justice brought federal charges against Hankison, but also Joshua Janes, Kyle Meany, and Kelly Goodlett. Who are these other officers, and what were the charges?
So Janes and Meany were detectives involved in getting that initial warrant for Breonna's apartment. Goodlett was another detective who helped with the warrant process.
So not the officers who were physically at the scene of the shooting.
That's right. The Justice Department alleged a conspiracy, obstruction of justice, and civil rights violations. They claimed Janes and Meany falsified information to get the warrant and then created a false cover story to avoid being held accountable.
So essentially they lied to get permission to raid Breonna's home?
That was the prosecution's argument, yes. And importantly, Goodlett later pleaded guilty to 2 counts of conspiracy. She admitted to lying on the warrant application and writing a false report to cover it up.
Wow, that's a huge development. Her testimony must have been critical.
Mm-hmm.
And what about Hankison specifically? His federal charges were related to civil rights violations, correct?
Yes, he faced charges for what's called unconstitutional use of excessive force.
Okay.
Specifically for firing those 10 rounds through Breonna's covered window and glass door.
So even though he'd been acquitted of the state charges, he still had to face these federal charges with different legal standards at play.
Exactly. His federal trial started in October 2023, and it was a highly anticipated moment. Unfortunately, the jury couldn't reach a verdict, resulting in a mistrial.
So they had to start the whole trial process over again.
Yes, a retrial was scheduled, and in October 2024, a jury found Hankison guilty of violating Breonna's civil rights through his use of excessive force.
Wow, it was a long road, but there was at least some measure of accountability for his actions.
Yes, it was a long and difficult process for all involved, but that guilty verdict did bring a sliver of justice for Breonna and her family.
What about the other officers, Janes and Meany? Were their cases resolved as well?
Well, there's a significant turn of events here. In August 2024, a federal judge, Judge Charles Simpson, dismissed 2 felony charges against them. These were charges of deprivation of rights under color of law.
Okay.
He ruled that Kenneth Walker firing that warning shot was ultimately the legal cause of Breonna's death, not the allegedly falsified warrant itself.
What?
This basically downgraded their charges to misdemeanors.
So help me understand this. Even though they allegedly lied to obtain the warrant, they weren't held fully accountable because Walker, in his own home, defended himself.
That's the essence of the judge's ruling. It's important to note that the remaining charges against them, including making false statements to investigators and falsifying records, were not dismissed.
Okay.
But that ruling regarding the felony charges was highly controversial.
Yeah, it feels like the legal system is sending a very mixed message here. This case had repercussions far beyond just those criminal charges, though. There are also several lawsuits, right?
Absolutely. Breonna's family filed a wrongful death lawsuit against the officers and the city of Louisville. That resulted in a $12 million settlement in September 2020.
That's a substantial sum. Was there more to that settlement?
Yes, the settlement also included a commitment from the city to implement a series of police reforms.
What kind of reforms are we talking about here? Were they substantial changes?
They included mandatory body cameras for all officers, changes to how search warrants are obtained and executed, and a requirement for officers to intervene if they witness misconduct by a colleague.
Oh, wow.
These were steps in the right direction, aimed at addressing the systemic issues highlighted by this case.
And were there other legal actions stemming from that night?
Yes. Breonna's neighbor, who lived in the apartment next door, also filed a lawsuit.
Oh, wow.
She alleged that officers fired blindly into her apartment during the raid.
Oh, my God.
And Kenneth Walker himself filed a lawsuit against the Louisville Metro Police Department, alleging misconduct and stating that he did not fire the bullet that injured Mattingly. He later reached a $2 million settlement with the city.
It's a stark illustration of how one event can have such a devastating ripple effect. The legal battles are only part of this story, though.
Right.
Breonna Taylor's case ignited protests across the country, becoming a symbol of something much larger.
Absolutely. Breonna's name became synonymous with the fight for racial justice and police accountability. Her death, along with other high-profile killings of Black people by police, fueled a national reckoning on these issues.
We've gone into detail on the legal proceedings and the societal impact, but I want to circle back to those discrepancies and conflicting pieces of information within this case. What stood out to you as particularly problematic?
Well, that initial police report claiming Breonna wasn't injured is a glaring discrepancy. It was demonstrably false.
Right.
Then there were the conflicting accounts about those packages allegedly being delivered to Breonna's apartment.
You mentioned earlier that police believed Glover might have been using her address to receive drugs.
Yes, the warrant stated this was verified through a U.S. postal inspector.
Okay.
But the U.S. Postal Inspection Service refuted that, saying they'd been asked to monitor packages going to Breonna's apartment and found nothing suspicious.
So the basis for the warrant, the intrusion into Breonna's home, might have been fabricated.
That possibility was investigated, and it significantly undermined the credibility of the police narrative. Then, of course, there's the lack of body camera footage, which only amplified the confusion.
Without that footage, it becomes a case of one word against another.
Exactly. The officers claimed they announced themselves. Walker insisted they didn't.
Right.
The only independent witness who initially supported the police account later changed his statement.
Wow.
It created a fog of uncertainty around the most crucial moments.
It's a tragedy upon a tragedy that we may never know exactly what happened in those crucial moments before the shooting.
Yeah, that lack of clarity just adds to the pain and frustration surrounding this entire case.
Then there was the confusion surrounding who shot Officer Mattingly. Can you walk us through that?
Initially, Walker stated that Breonna had fired the shot. He later retracted that, saying he fired a warning shot towards the ground.
And what did the forensic evidence reveal about that?
A Kentucky State Police ballistics report was inconclusive. It couldn't definitively say whether the bullet that hit Mattingly came from Walker's gun. Due to limited markings, they couldn't prove or disprove it.
So there's reasonable doubt about that detail even now.
There is. Walker's legal team also raised questions about the lack of blood found where Mattingly was supposedly shot.
Huh.
They suggested he might have been hit by friendly fire from another officer. That hasn't been officially confirmed, though.
It feels like this case, from beginning to end, is shrouded in conflicting accounts and unanswered questions.
It is, and it's precisely this kind of case that raises profound questions about police procedures, the use of no-knock warrants, and the deep-rooted systemic racism that impacts our criminal justice system.
We've covered a lot of ground, but there's more to explore. We want to shift gears a bit. We've laid out the details, the events, the legal battles, but what does it all mean? What are the larger issues that this case brought to light?
Yeah, this case really forced a national conversation about policing in America, about justice, and about how systemic racism plays out in the most tragic ways.
We've talked about the use of no-knock warrants, the lack of body cam footage, the inconsistencies in the police narrative, and the feeling that for many, justice was not served. Let's start with these no-knock warrants. Why are they so controversial, and why did this case bring them to the forefront?
Imagine yourself in your own home in the middle of the night, and suddenly people are breaking down your door. It's a terrifying scenario for anyone. It's inherently chaotic, and that chaos can have deadly consequences. In Breonna's case, her boyfriend, Kenneth Walker, believed that they were being robbed. He reacted as many would to protect himself and Breonna.
And that split-second decision, born out of fear and confusion, set in motion this chain of events that led to her death.
Exactly. And that's why many people are calling for no-knock warrants to be banned outright, or at the very least used only in the most extreme circumstances where there's a clear and imminent threat to public safety. Breonna's case tragically illustrates the potential for these warrants to go horribly wrong.
The lack of body cam footage also played a huge role in the difficulty of piecing together what happened.
Absolutely. Body cameras are, in many ways, about transparency and accountability. They can corroborate or contradict witness statements and provide crucial evidence. The fact that those officers weren't wearing body cameras, well, it left us with a huge gap in understanding the events that night.
And that lack of a clear visual record, understandably, fueled so much of the public distrust and suspicion.
Right. When there's a void of information, people naturally start to question the official narrative, especially in a case as high-profile and emotionally charged as this one.
This case also brought the painful issue of systemic racism in policing to the forefront of our national dialogue.
Yes, the fact that Breonna, a Black woman, was killed in her own home by police during a raid based on a questionable warrant, well, it sparked a necessary conversation about racial bias in law enforcement. This case, unfortunately, is not an isolated incident.
Right.
It reflects a larger pattern of disproportionate use of force against people of color.
And it fueled a nationwide movement demanding police reform and accountability.
People took to the streets demanding justice for Breonna and an end to police brutality. These protests demanded systemic changes, not just in individual cases, but in the culture of policing. Things like implicit bias training, addressing racial profiling, and demilitarizing police forces.
It's been years since Breonna Taylor's death, and looking back now, what would you say is the lasting legacy of this case?
I think Breonna's case served as a wake-up call for many. It forced a reckoning on racial justice, on police brutality, on the excessive use of force. It led to important conversations, policy changes in some cities, and a renewed focus on holding law enforcement accountable for their actions.
Breonna's name has become synonymous with the fight for justice and equality, a symbol of a system that still has so far to go. Her death has had a profound impact on our society.
It has. It's a stark reminder of the work that still needs to be done to ensure that everyone, regardless of race, is treated with dignity and respect by law enforcement. It's a reminder that these are not just abstract issues, they have real human consequences.
This deep dive has been heavy, heartbreaking even. It's important to remember Breonna Taylor, not as a name in a headline, but as a young woman whose life was tragically taken.
Her story is a powerful reminder of what's at stake when we talk about systemic failures and the importance of continuing to push for justice and reform. We can't let her death be in vain.
If there's one thing I hope our listeners take away from this, it's that we must continue to demand accountability and transparency from those in power, and to work for meaningful change in our justice system.
We all have a role to play in creating a more just and equitable society. That work starts with awareness, with understanding, and with a commitment to never forgetting cases like Breonna Taylor's.
Thank you for joining us for this difficult but crucial deep dive into the Breonna Taylor case. We encourage you to explore the sources we've provided, to learn more, to think critically, and to engage in these important conversations.
And if there are cases you'd like for us to break down in future episodes, please send us an email at info@beyondcriminalcourts.com. We appreciate you being a part of this journey towards understanding and hopefully positive change.
Until next time, stay informed, stay engaged, and keep fighting for what's right.